In the September of 2013, a television show would be broadcast for the first time on BBC Two that revolutionized the historical drama genre. Bringing the gloomy underworld of Birmingham's organized crime scene to our screens, Peaky Blinders would be both critically acclaimed and commercially successful. 6 series and an upcoming film later, it remains as popular as it ever was, documenting the rise and exploits of the Peaky Blinders Crime Gang, led by the fictional Tommy Shelby. While the show takes some creative liberties in its storytelling, character design, and historical accuracy, the Peaky Blinders were indeed a real crime gang that operated on the streets of Birmingham. Over the course of their existence, some 1,000 criminals signed up with the Peaky Blinders to make a living from extortion, bookmaking, fencing, hijacking, robbery, and more, covering not only the city, but the entirety of the West Midlands region. But who were these flat-cap-wearing hooligans really? What does the show get right and wrong? Who led these nefarious gangsters to criminal glory across the late 1800s? And what became of them when they declined? In today's video, we aim to answer all of these questions and more, delving into the files to bring you up close and personal with the real, successful, and often brutal organized criminals of the Peaky Blinders Crime Gang. The early days of the real-life Peaky Blinders can be traced back to the 1850s, long before the actual founding of the gang itself. This was a time of tumultuous uncertainty in the English West Midlands city of Birmingham, the second largest city in Britain. Economic hardship that had been brewing since the turn of the century had reached something of a boiling point, and crime was rife. Nowhere were the effects of this hardship more prominent than in the youth of Birmingham, as young men turned to crime in an effort to bring in money for their hungry families. Over time, adolescent men from impoverished families would gather together on the streets, coordinating robberies and pickpocketing attempts on passers-by from the cover of dark alleyways. Certain neighborhoods within Birmingham were little more than slums at this time, and these became particularly dangerous areas to walk through, especially at night or alone. At this point in time, these youth gangs' efforts to organize their criminal exploits were messy. Many of the gangsters involved in these robberies and muggings were quite literally children and lacked the experience or strength of adults. They relied on chaotic acts of violence in order to forcibly take money and possessions from strangers, and these encounters often turned violent. These young criminals would carry knives as they robbed passers-by and didn't hesitate to use them. There are also reports of victims being savagely beaten and even strangled as these persistent criminals stopped at nothing to get their way. For the poor youths of 1800s Birmingham, there were very few options outside of a life of crime, and many were, unfortunately, doomed to become criminals from the get-go. The streets of many of England's major cities were filled with gambling dens, underground fighting rings, and drugs, which resulted in many disadvantaged teenagers coming together alongside dangerous company. These establishments and activities were littered with the very worst of Birmingham's citizens, and as one thing led to another, there was little escape from crime for those unfortunate enough to be born into poverty. By the 1850s and 1860s, this massive underworld of criminal activity had been enough for the perceived upper classes or social elite of Birmingham to press law enforcement to do something about it. Those with money were prime targets for these disorganized street gangs, and since they had the money and power, the police were willing to listen. What followed was the rise of the slogging gang, a more organized form of street gang closely associated with Birmingham and the West Midlands. As police officers attempted to wrestle control over Birmingham's most impoverished areas from the criminals, inevitable clashes took place, which often became extremely violent. Slogging gang members would attack police officers on sight, while the officers did everything in their power to place them under arrest. These newly organized crime groups didn't stop at assaulting police officers either. They would often attack passers-by on the street in the hopes of robbing them of their wealth or, by some accounts, simply because they could. Slogging gang members were typically adolescents or young adults with older, more experienced members in their 30s, while new recruits joined up from the worrying low age of 12. By the 1880s and 1890s, some of these gangs had become very powerful indeed, and police efforts to stop them in their tracks had largely been unsuccessful. Some gangs would find a sense of identity in their criminal activities, developing their own subcultures, hierarchies, and lifestyles. One gang in particular, by the end of the 1880s, had become large enough to become the talk of the city, with their persistent violent crimes, growing wealth, and iconic clothing. They were, of course, the Peaky Blinders. The Peaky Blinders were officially formed as an organized crime gang in the late 1880s. Most historians who are familiar with the topic believe the exact year to have been 1887. A man by the name of Thomas Mucklow, a loose inspiration for the television character of Tommy Shelby, founded the Peaky Blinders and would remain one of its most prominent and important members across the gang's reign. The gang found its origins in the inner city area of Small Heath, around 2 miles southeast of the city center. Almost all of the Peaky Blinders members, including Thomas Mucklow himself, came from the same impoverished or working-class backgrounds as their 1850s forerunners and saw their criminal activities as a means of escaping the financial struggles of their difficult lives. The gang found their calling in quick, calculated, violent robberies, ambushing members of the public on the street with knives and brute force. First and foremost, the Peaky Blinders sought money and would seemingly stop at nothing to get it. Racketeering became a common venture, with numerous fraudulent businesses and money-making schemes cropping up over the south of the city in the 1890s. The gangsters took control of the gambling establishments that had been so prominent in the city for decades prior, and also became heavily embroiled in illegal bookmaking, taking in money from thousands of the city's residents as they did so. They soon began cooperating with members of the city's criminals who weren't involved with the Peaky Blinders, providing a valuable fencing service to those who wished to part ways with stolen goods. A vast quantity of stolen goods would work its way through the Peaky Blinders' territory on a daily basis. The gang also made a great deal of money hijacking vehicles and smuggling substances into the city, selling them on to the highest bidder. The Peaky Blinders are just as well known for their iconic appearances as they are for their crimes. Members typically found a sense of solidarity and identity in how they dressed, which often distinguished them from the other large gangs across the West Midlands. The average Peaky Blinders gangster would typically be dressed in tailored jackets, with a long lapelled trench coat over the top. Underneath, smart shirts and waistcoats were worn, perhaps with a silk scarf around the neck during the colder months. This was complemented with a pair of bell-bottom trousers and well-polished leather boots. But the piece de resistance of the Peaky Blinders look was the flat cap. The flat cap, perhaps even more so than the overall outfit, has become closely associated with the Peaky Blinders following the success of the television series, especially in England, even to those who haven't seen it. An urban legend behind the Peaky Blinders flat caps implies that they were much more than a fashion statement. British author John Douglas, who lived in Birmingham at the time the gang rose to power, noted in his novel A Walk Down Summer Lane that the gangsters would conceal razor blades that were sewn into the lining of their flat caps. If a fight broke out, a Peaky Blinder could headbutt the opposition in the face, potentially blinding them or slashing their faces wide open if they managed to strike with enough precision and force. While this has become a popular method of violence associated with the gang and has been depicted in the television show, it's unfortunately not accurate. Replaceable razor blades were not manufactured in the United Kingdom until the year 1908, several decades after the gang had disappeared from the streets of Birmingham. While that violent myth may not be true, the gang likely obtained its name from the real function those hats served. Historian Carl Chin, who has undertaken extensive work on the contemporary history of the city of Birmingham, has noted that at the time, the word peaky was a slang for any cap with a peak, and that blinder was a slang term used to denote a smart or dapper appearance. When a Peaky Blinder robbed a member of the public, they were known to sneak up from behind, immediately pulling their own hat down over their victims' faces. Before the victim could react or gather themselves, the gangster had fled into a nearby alley with his ill-gotten earnings. This way, it was impossible to link the crime back to the criminal, and the gang developed a modus operandi of sorts. While several notorious street gangs operated in Birmingham from the end of the 1800s until the start of the First World War, the Peaky Blinders were the most notorious, known for their violent, merciless techniques. From the get-go, they had made a name for themselves as criminals who would go out of their way to brutally beat their victims before they robbed them, as evidenced by a newspaper article printed in the Birmingham Mail on the 24th of March, 1890, evidence. The article, entitled, "A Murderous Outrage at Small Heath, a Man's Skull Fractured," is the earliest known piece of literature mentioning the Peaky Blinders by name, although they are thought to have been officially founded 3 years prior. The article read, "A serious assault was committed upon a young man named George Eastwood, living at 3 Court, 2 House, Arthur Street, Small Heath, on Saturday night. It seems that Eastwood, who has been for some time a total abstainer, called between 10 and 11 o'clock at the Rainbow Public House in Adderley Street and was supplied with a bottle of ginger beer. Shortly afterwards, several men known as the Peaky Blinders Gang, whom Eastwood knew by sight from their living in the same neighborhood as himself, came in. Later in 1890, the gang seemed to be actively seeking fame. Following an assault on a member of the public that year, the perpetrators sent a letter to several of the United Kingdom's biggest newspapers announcing their arrival on the streets of Birmingham. They soon became notorious across the country, but did not expand their territories outside of the West Midlands region. This saw the Peaky Blinders make many enemies, as rival gangs attempted to gain control of Birmingham and the surrounding areas. As a result, gang warfare often broke out en masse on the streets of Small Heath, which resulted in deadly shootouts and large-scale brawls. The Peaky Blinders had an infamously difficult relationship with the police, and over the course of their domain, are thought to have injured hundreds of officers. The police force actually saw a notable decline in their officers, as many feared that they would be attacked or even killed on duty. It wasn't unheard of for the gangsters to ambush police officers and take their lives. In an act that would come to be known as constable baiting, the Peaky Blinders would lure officers into their hideouts and territories, only to beat them within an inch of their lives when they arrived. This was likely an effort to raise the profile of the gang and actively put officers off from entering their domain. It worked too. Police Constable George Snipe was killed by the Peaky Blinders in 1897. A few years later, once the gang had obtained regional notoriety, they killed Constable Charles Philip Gunther in 1901, further adding to their infamy. In 1899, at the height of the gang's power, an Irish police chief by the name of Charles Houghton Rafter was contracted to help bring law and order to the city of Birmingham. Rafter was an accomplished officer, with over 16 years of service to his name by the time he arrived in Birmingham. But ultimately, not even he could stop the rising tide of organized crime in the city. The Peaky Blinders had their hooks well and truly dug into the local police force, and corruption and bribery effectively stopped Rafter's attempts to control Birmingham in their tracks. When committing crimes and battling rivals, the Peaky Blinders utilized a whole arsenal of weapons. Knives were the most common and were carried by most members of the gang to use in an emergency, but guns were just as prevalent. Their guns of choice were typically revolvers, such as the Webley Bulldog, which was widely available and easy to use. The television show, which is set after World War I, shows the Peaky Blinders using weapons that were commonplace in the war. Lewis machine guns and Lee Enfield rifles, to name a few. For the real Peaky Blinders, these weapons would have been hard, if not impossible, to come by, and may only have started to filter into common use after the war broke out. In addition to guns and knives, a wide range of melee weapons were picked up and utilized by the Peaky Blinders. They tended to harness everything from steel toe-capped boots, fire irons, and canes. But a personal favorite seems to have been a large buckled belt. George Eastwood, the man described in the 1890 Birmingham Mail article, was reportedly beaten with heavy belt buckles as the gangsters swung the belts like whips. There is a surprising lack of information available on the distinct lives behind the members of the Peaky Blinders, given the success of the television show. But some identities have been revealed through the subsequent historical archives. At the forefront of the organization was Thomas Mucklow, who would be the first man to be officially described as a Peaky Blinder. For a long while, his life was largely a mystery, as he strove to remain below the law's radar. But a 1921 census released online via Find My Past in 2022 provides a few clues as to who he really was. Mucklow was born in 1865 in Small Heath and later married a woman by the name of Elizabeth Groom. Until he founded the Peaky Blinders, he found work as a carter, but struggled to make ends meet with just this income alone. He would spend his days moving items by way of wagon or horse and cart, while Elizabeth stayed at home as a housewife. Mucklow himself took part in the beating of George Eastwood in 1890 and actually fractured his skull, but received only 9 months in prison. When he was released, he moved in with his in-laws, where he would subsequently receive a series of shorter prison sentences for stealing. In 1902, deep into his time as a founding Peaky Blinders member, he received a 6-month prison sentence with hard labor for maliciously wounding another man. The man turned out to be his father-in-law, George Groom, and by all accounts, he stayed with Elizabeth long after this. By the time the 1921 census was taken, Mucklow was 57 years of age and had avoided being drafted into the military to fight in World War I. Reportedly, the most powerful member of the Peaky Blinders gang was a man by the name of Thomas Gilbert. He has proved particularly difficult to track over the years as he intentionally changed his name every few years to evade capture. Most often, he went by Kevin Mooney. He was tasked with overseeing the many land-grabbing attempts made by the Peaky Blinders over their years of operation, heading into the turf of rival gangs, instigating wars, and bringing in money. He also succeeded in unifying several groups of existing criminals under the Peaky Blinders moniker, making them one of the biggest organized street gangs in Birmingham's history. Outside of Mucklow and Gilbert, additional gang members are rather hard to pin down and identify. Those that are known have been identified on the basis of their criminal records and prison sentences. Some of the organization's most prominent members included Stephen McNichol, Harry Fowles, David Taylor, and Ernest Haynes. Fowles was very young when he joined up with the Peaky Blinders, and in 1904, aged just 19, he served a prison sentence for stealing a bicycle. Other than that, very little is known of him. McNichol and Haynes are known to have worked together on a home invasion, likely in an attempt to rinse the house of valuables, and were arrested together, but only served 1 month in custody. David Taylor found himself in trouble with the law aged just 13, after an officer searched him and found a loaded firearm concealed on his person. The dying days of the Peaky Blinders coincided with the outbreak of World War I, and many members were either conscripted or enlisted to join the British Army after its outbreak. One gangster, by the name of Henry Lightfoot, joined up with and left the British Army on 3 separate occasions during his life and actually served at the infamous Battle of the Somme in 1916. In addition to law enforcement, the Peaky Blinders frequently clashed with members of other organized crime gangs on the streets of Birmingham throughout their years of operation. This competition was there from the very beginning, and it wasn't friendly. The Small Heath region of Birmingham was occupied by a gang known as the Cheapside Sloggers when the Peaky Blinders first rose to power, and Thomas Gilbert was not able to reason with them. The Sloggers wanted to be the only gang in charge of this part of the city, but so did the Peaky Blinders. This led to the two gangs frequently coming to blows in public, in violent brawls known as postcode battles. This particularly brutal means of seizing power in a certain area actually helped to minimize violence going forward and created specific boundaries between territories for each gang. This being said, the Cheapside Sloggers were infamous for their role in underground street fighting and weren't easy adversaries to live alongside. Over their later years, the Peaky Blinders faced further competition, first and foremost from the Sabini gang, led by British-Italian mob boss Charles Darby Sabini. he would really rise to power during the interwar years, but in the 1910s and early 1920s caused a multitude of problems for the Peaky Blinders. Sabini took control of Birmingham's Little Italy area around this time and eventually took control of the racecourses across the city. A great deal of his money was brought in from nightclubs alongside this, and he was said to have had around 100 members at his disposal from the start. The gang included Sicilian gunmen who had traveled over to settle in Birmingham specifically to join the gang. Unlike the Peaky Blinders, they definitely did specialize in razor attacks and used their power and influence to bribe political officials, judges, police officers, and local businesses. Sabini himself actually appears as a character in the Peaky Blinders television show, and he did indeed interact with the gang on a regular basis. Turf wars with the Sabini gang often turned violent, and Sabini would not hesitate to order his men to slash their foes with their razors when necessary. The most formidable enemies of the Peaky Blinders, however, were the ones that were ultimately responsible for their downfall: the Birmingham Boys. Around the turn of the century, the Birmingham Boys were relatively new to the scene. They were the first to control Birmingham's racecourses, just before Sabini moved in, and they weren't happy with the Peaky Blinders' attempts at moving in on their turf. The further the Peaky Blinders moved into the city center, the more competition they faced, and the Birmingham Boys weren't about to go down without a fight. Violent clashes in the city center, unlike anything they had encountered before, eventually drove the Peaky Blinders out into the surrounding countryside of the West Midlands. By the 1920s, the Blinders had all but disappeared from the West Midlands altogether as they struggled to make ends meet. They had lost a great deal of business after the Birmingham Boys had effectively ousted them from their domain, but their usurper's day would come when Sabini eventually took control of the city once and for all. It wasn't just warfare and clashes with other gangs that brought about the fall of the Peaky Blinders, however. Around the turn of the 1920s, free education had become more readily available, which provided the youth of Birmingham with a steady route into an honest living. No longer were the poor doomed to a life of crime. They now had more equal opportunities. Moreover, the Blinders' legacy and reputation for fighting police officers had caused the law to crack down on them hard. Sentences for Peaky Blinders members had become extreme, with judges handing down the maximum amount of time they could give for those affiliated with the organization. The changing world simply could not make room for a gang who had made their criminal activities part of their identity in such a loud and obvious way. The Peaky Blinders' legacy may be larger than any other British organized crime gang, despite the fact that there is much about their operations and lives that went under the radar. For decades that followed their decline, the term Peaky Blinder would be used to describe any violent street youth in England, and they remained at the forefront of the British consciousness for many years that followed. Little would be heard regarding the gang after that term went out of fashion, of course, until the legendary television show appeared on our screens in September 2013. While the Peaky Blinders television show is only loosely based on the real-life history of the gang of the same name, it has had a massive impact on popular culture, specifically across the United Kingdom, following the time it aired. Not only did the show receive almost universal critical acclaim, but two names from the show, Arthur and Ada, actually rose into the list of the most popular British boys and girls names respectively in 2018. Peaky Blinders-themed events and parties can even be attended across much of central and northern England. Presently, travelers flying from Birmingham Airport can attend the Shelby Encumbered Bar and Kitchen, which serves dishes named after characters and places shown in the show. The impact generated by the show even goes beyond the United Kingdom. Ukraine's National Guard, for instance, famously have a unit nicknamed the Peaky Blinders, who wear flat caps in their combat efforts against the Russian military. In the December of 2024, soldiers from the unit were sent gifts from the series creators, with official channels releasing the news. The legendary National Guard unit now has actual caps from Stephen Knight, the scriptwriter of the cult series of the same name, with the autograph of the main character, Cillian Murphy. While we may never know many of the inner workings and nefarious dealings of the real-life Peaky Blinders, we have a good foundation of knowledge to go from, thanks to historical police records, censuses, and newspaper articles. While the television show may not be the most accurate reproduction of the Blinders' real-life story, it has helped to put Birmingham on the map on a global scale and has brought the brutal reality of British gang life in the early 1900s to wider audiences. Very few gangs have been able to attain the same level of infamy as the Peaky Blinders did in their golden age, and as a result, theirs is a name which is now infamous across every household in Britain. Hopefully, if more documents and resources are discovered in the future, we can paint an even clearer picture of the Peaky Blinders' individual members and their criminal exploits across Birmingham's shady underworld.